Good afternoon. And Dave, thanks for joining us in what is the first of a new series of conversations we're doing with experts and officials such as yourself through Zoom.
Thank you, Trey. It's great to be here.
So everyone should have Dave Maxwell's bio, but he is currently a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a 30-year veteran of the United States Army with extensive experience in Korea. We will be taking questions towards the end of our discussion. So to submit a question, please just use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll go through those later on. But so, Dave, I'd like to start off. Clearly things were slightly different when we first reached out to you about doing this. But, after about 3 weeks of being out of sight, Kim Jong-un was finally seen in public, this past weekend. During that time, there were lots of rumors about what had happened, some of them quite fantastical, perhaps, some of them about, things that like China would just take over North Korea. Why did we get this so wrong?
Well, that's a great question. As you know, and I think everybody watching knows, North Korea is the hardest target, from an intelligence perspective. It's a closed society. And, and I think there are many factors. One is, rumors grow and spread. There's much greater communication inside North Korea. And of course, the original story about his, botched operation and then, perhaps death came from Daily NK, who have extensive sources inside North Korea. But I think, as it turns out, it does appear that he did have some kind of medical procedure. I think that evidence, the mark on his right wrist, I've had a number of people who've actually had a similar heart medical procedure, have said, yeah, that's the way it's done. You put a stent in that way. So it does appear that he did have a medical procedure. And of course, given his obvious health conditions, obesity, smoking and drinking, his lifestyle, he's certainly at risk. And so, and then I think that, rumors and people's desires, I think that people definitely, some people were kind of hoping that something happened to him, which I say that, with quotations there. No one should hope for his demise. No one should hope for instability and regime collapse. But the one thing about this entire incident, it should be a wake-up call. Something could happen, and we need to be prepared. And the discussions that I've seen in public, means the public is not aware, not prepared. I think our government is. I think the military is. But I think as a general public, we are not ready for something that's going to happen in North Korea, and this should be a wake-up call.
Yeah, and I think this is really kind of what I'd like to do today when we talk is sort of get into these issues of, how we prepare, because it didn't happen this time. It doesn't mean it'll happen next time he disappears either. But, we really kind of need to think through, how we handle the situation and what it really means, because, there was lots of talk about basically, oh, if he's passed away, like it's gonna be complete instability. That may or may not be the case. There's a lot of factors, I think, that get into that. But, sort of along these lines, from your experience, what kinds of things should we actually be looking for to determine, one, I guess, if there really is a serious medical issue, and two, if instability was, beginning to take place?
Yes. So, of course, I think the first problem is if he is incapacitated or dead, there's got to be a transition process. And I think we all know there is no succession mechanism other than dynastic hereditary succession. And we don't know if anybody has been designated. 94 and 2011, each had designated their son, and there was a process. We don't know for sure whether Kim Jong-un, his sister, has been designated, or perhaps his uncle, Kim Jong-il. We just don't know. But what's interesting is to compare what happened in 94 and 2011 and today. Each time this happened, they locked down the country, they sealed the borders, they recall the members of the Politburo, the OGD, the Organization Guidance Department, supervises a meeting, and they plan the transition. And since the transition was already set, it took about a day or so for the results to be announced. In this case, there's two things that are complicating it. One, as I said, no known designated successor, but two, the COVID-19 virus has already shut down the country. They closed the borders. So some of the indicators that we might see from satellite of military movements and things, everybody's locked down already. And so we might not see that happening. And so things can be occurring inside, and we just don't know what is happening. In fact, even in both cases in 94 and 2011, we did not learn right away that the dear and supreme and great leaders were dead. Which comes to the real question is, if we learn today that Kim Jong-un is dead, what actions do we take? What actions are we ready to take right now? And that's, I think, one of the first key questions that we should consider. The US government, the South Korean government, do we wait and see, or do we immediately reach out to whoever appears to be in charge? And do we seize the initiative to try to shape the future? I think that's really a key question that we should be considering.
Yeah, and I'd like to sort of talk with you about this more because, there's what goes on in North Korea, and we need to understand how that's happening and what's going on. So that way, one, we react appropriately, because you don't want to react in a way that perhaps escalates a situation that's not necessarily occurring, but at the same time, in your prior life in the military, you were involved in actually trying to think through a lot of this, helped to develop the first conceptual plan 5029. Even though we think through these processes, what are the real challenges of even trying to think through what steps should we take if we think this is actually happening?
Well, that's really a great question, and one we have to continue to wrestle with, because the conditions that lead to instability could lead to a decision to execute the North's campaign plan to unify the peninsula by force. By that I mean, if Kim Jong-un is threatened, or if someone else who is nominally in charge feels threatened, they may believe that their only option may be to execute their campaign plan and to unify by force. Now that seems far-fetched to us because North Korea will not win a war against South Korea and the United States. However, that may be their only option. And so that means as we think about how to deal with this, we have to think about the worst case, and where we need to continue to deter an attack, but be ready to deal with an attack, even as we might be considering many of the contingencies that we have to consider inside North Korea, which includes a humanitarian disaster, which includes refugee flow, which includes internal civil war as North Korean military units compete for resources to try to survive, which leads to chaos and anarchy. And of course, weapons of mass destruction, that has to be dealt with. And then of course, the bigger problem is the remnants of a North Korean military, or a broken down military. Since it is a guerrilla dynasty, we have to think about resistance. And it is likely that people and military units inside North Korea are going to resist any outside intervention, whether it's from South Korea or China, or South Korea and the United States together. There will be resistance, I think, that could make Iraq and Afghanistan pale in comparison.
Actually, this is sort of an interesting point. There was an article which I saw that suggested, and I kind of alluded to this early on, that China would, take over, or at least go in to prop up someone who they favored. And I've always found this somewhat, sort of an interesting, awkward idea in that, we talk about often, why North Korea developed nuclear weapons. And, the presumption is often, it's to prevent the United States from, invading. That being said, China is also a country that North Korea has, historical tensions with. At the same time, it would seem to me that if you had a situation to where things were coming apart, whether it's a transition to a successor, or whether it's just, a series of, warlords who now control certain areas, one of those generals who now has control would have control of the nuclear weapons. And my guess is that they would probably send a signal to China that if China intervened, that there was a risk that, these could be utilized. So, how much of a deterrent to, despite maybe the common perception, and maybe I'm wrong, and please tell me if I am, but do you think those nuclear weapons would be to China's own intervention into North Korea in a situation like this?
Yeah, that's really unthinkable, but I think it's possible. I think we have to think about North Korea from that perspective is, even though North Korea and China have an alliance, the only alliance each of them have, closer than lips and teeth, on the surface, I think that, North Korea wants independence from everyone. It does not want to fall under China's rule. And I think even a successor regime, even the Korean people living in the North would not want to be occupied by China. And so I think that, and those nuclear weapons, whoever possesses them are going to use them for their own deterrence and for their own leverage. And of course, the worst case, to make money and proliferate and that they might leave the peninsula. We don't want loose nukes. We also don't want loose chemicals and their suspected biological weapons program as well. And that is a really complicated problem for the alliance and really for the international community to deal with. And the more unstable the situation is in the North, the more internal fighting that occurs, the greater the complexity and threat to the region and really to the alliance.
So, you mentioned resistance as well, briefly. And, there's a dynamic to this that wasn't in play when you were first looking at this issue, which is, now the world is wired. North Korea has a lot of, highly professional, cyber units. So, I mean, should we even consider now the possibility that, if this situation would occur, that we need to basically, build robustness into our systems to deal with potential North Korean cyber attacks, in an instability situation?
Absolutely, yes, you're right. In the 1990s, the internet was really just, starting out really in a big way. And we weren't really considering North Korea's cyber capability. We didn't consider them back then. But now you're absolutely right. And in fact, if you think about it, what we did postulate back then was a warning attack, an attack by by North Korea, to attack some targets in South Korea as a warning, stay out of our business. And that would be kinetic and artillery. But you're right to call attention to cyber, because what if they shut down the grid in South Korea? Or as we're concerned about here, the grid in the United States? Or what if they attack financial systems? They could so distract us that we would not be able to function in North Korea as we have to deal with the fallout, because a cyber attack and multiple attacks against multiple points of infrastructure, could be catastrophic. And that could cause real problems. Now, later, we always worry about military attacks with cyber, obviously, interdicting the flow of forces, things like that. But I think attacks on financial systems and infrastructure in the US, in South Korea, could be devastating. And that is something I think, if there is instability and collapse, we have to up our cyber defenses to a high degree.
So I want to take and shift the conversation a bit. We often talk about going after the loose nukes in North Korea if this situation would occur. And I want to get to that in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about something that I think we talk about less, which is that, there is the possibility, because, there's always a range that, collapse happens, the regime withers, but, there isn't necessarily resistance. And in that type of scenario, one where you can actually send troops up, there is this other humanitarian side of things. And how do we go about ensuring that, proper, food is getting to people, that, they have clean water, that all the basic necessities the population would need if, broader systems started breaking down, that, they have access to that. What kinds of steps do we need to take in that situation?
Well, of course, as we know, the public distribution system is already broken down, and it is the 400 or so markets in North Korea that really are helping to feed the people. But of course, with the COVID-19 virus, shutting down the borders, shutting down smuggling, stopping movement, I think those markets are really impacted. So, if something were to happen right now, there is going to be a humanitarian disaster on a huge scale. And, food, medical, all of the essential services will need to be provided. Now, one of the ways to do that, and of course, South Korea, the United States, are well equipped logistically to provide support. I mean, North Korea, even though the terrain is extremely difficult, it is a relatively small country. And, if there was no military threat, we could easily get food to key locations and things like that. And of course, we would also welcome non-governmental organizations, international organizations to contribute to that. I just don't think it's feasible, though, to put people in there without security, because even if it starts out benign, I think the potential for conflict remains high, whether it's the remnants of 1.2 million men under arms or people resisting because they've been indoctrinated to resist that way, which really goes to a key point I'd like to make, and that's information influence operations. For decades, we have advocated a campaign to try to provide information to the Korean people in the North and to the second tier leadership, those military commanders outside the regime, and of course to the elite as well. And of course, organizations like Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, defector organizations in South Korea, do provide a lot of information, but we're really not transmitting policy information. And most importantly, what comes next and what options do you have, General or local citizen, Mr. Kim, Mr. and Mrs. Kim? What are you going to do when there's no more Kim family regime? What options do you have? And that's the kind of information that we need to be continually transmitting to the North, to know that if something goes wrong, here are things that could happen, how you could cooperate, how you could end up with a better life. And that information campaign, it reminds me of the old saying, when is the best time to plant a tree? 25 years ago. And when is the second best time? Today. I wish we had embarked on this 25 years ago when we called for it. But there's never been any stomach for it for a lot of political reasons. We don't want to upset the North and the Chinese, and we don't want to undermine the regime. But we really need to embark on this now, especially in light of what just happened in the last couple of weeks, because I think that people are seeing that if he dies, it's really uncertain and it's complex what is going to happen. And so we need to have a foundation of information and influence with the intent to give people options other than resorting to violence, and to resort to cooperation and seeking that brighter future that President Trump offers, if Kim Jong-un makes the right strategic decision.
I mean, some of this can even be, more informal. Whatever contacts, the CIA, the South Korean intelligence services, have with North Korean officials, just making sure that they understand, that like, listen, we know nothing's happening now, but if the day ever comes, these are the types of options you have, that, this doesn't have to be a situation that leads to conflict. It can be one to where, we find a way to mutually resolve the situation. So, I mean, even those types of things, I think could be useful.
I would love to have the South Korean military provide cell phones to their counterpart corps commanders, the 4th, the 2nd, the 1st, and the 5th Corps, to have cell phones from the ROK Army in the South. And, in times of emergency, they'd be able to directly communicate. That would be something I would make part of the comprehensive military agreement from September 19th, 2018, to have direct communications across the DMZ, so when something happens, as this week with the firing on the guard posts, that their commanders to commander can speak, and not just in JSA, where North Korea may or may not listen to our calls.
Okay. So before I turn over to some of the questions our audience has, I did mention I wanted to talk to you about how we handle going after the nuclear program in this type of situation. And so I guess, this is really a two-part question, which is that first, what is sort of the best way of ensuring that, nuclear weapons or nuclear material don't leave the peninsula? And then two, how do we really coordinate with this with China? Most of North Korea's nuclear facilities are closer to China than to South Korea. So it seems like we need some type of coordination with Beijing.
Absolutely. First, I would recommend, in times of instability, when there is no longer a functioning regime in the North, I would recommend that South Korea, the U.S., and China establish a joint coordination element. I would call for that, and I know that that's been discussed in informal channels with the Chinese and South Koreans. But there really needs to be a joint coordination element to ensure some transparency and really to coordinate efforts. There is a need for an information influence program against those commanders who possess nuclear weapons. And they need to know that if they turn them over to competent authorities, that they'll have a place in a unified Korea, in what comes next. So there's got to be a co-option mechanism there. And of course, the coercion is, if you use it, you will lose it, and you will lose your life. And so there's that aspect. Now, the military operation to secure weapons is extremely complex. It is forces heavy, meaning it takes a lot of military forces, whether they're South Korean and U.S. together or Chinese, because they do have the proximity, as you say, to most of the nuclear facilities. But one of the things that people don't talk about, and I'd like to make this point as the most important one, we will need to close off North Korea. We will need to seal the air and sea routes of transport. Now, land, obviously, the DMZ is well fortified. China and Russia will have to seal their borders as well and be responsible for not allowing nuclear weapons to cross into their territory. But it is air and sea that we really need to lock down. But even more than that, and that's a military operation to do that, what we really need to do is completely shut down North Korea's overseas illicit activities network that support proliferation, because it is that network that is going to get weapons from North Korea and sell them to the highest bidder, to rogue nations or to terrorist organizations. And so at the time of instability, once we determine it's real, we really need to work with countries around the world, our friends, partners, and allies, but really all countries that have North Korean diplomatic missions that house their illicit activities operations. They really need to be shut down, and they need to be unable to send things back and forth, to use counterfeit money, to traffic in drugs as they're doing right now, and to move weapons, any kind of weapons, but most importantly, weapons of mass destruction anywhere in the world. We have to shut that down on a global basis. And together, then we can go in to the local facilities inside North Korea to seize, secure, render safe, and then eventually remove those weapons, which will be a dangerous and complex operation in itself.
Yeah. So I want to turn to some of our audience questions. I want to start with one from Dan Lieberman, really fairly straightforward, which is a question about if Kim Jong-un did have an operation and he used a catheter to do a heart operation, why not just cover the entry site with a wristband or something? I guess the deeper question that maybe Dan is getting at is this maybe a North Korean operation to try and get us to think something that maybe didn't happen?
Very true. And we know North Korea is masters of denial and deception, and they do show us things that they want us to see, whether it's from satellite pictures, but yeah, this could be an obvious effort at deception. And I think that Dan is exactly right. We do need to consider that nothing happened. And, and then we need to try to figure out what is their intent and what effects are they trying to achieve by doing that. And sometimes I think that, based on some of the reports, he was sitting back in Wonsan, sipping cognac, smoking cigars, and marveling at how the entire world was concerned with his health. And I think that, he may be, this could be all, ego purposes. He's a narcissist. But I think what are the effects he's trying to achieve if he's gone for 20 days, if he did or did not have a medical procedure, if he shows us he had a medical procedure, that is really something for all of us to try to wrap our heads around.
So Guy Argoni sent in a question beforehand, and he was really kind of wondering. He says, during the Nomu Young and the George W. Bush administrations, there was a sense that instability in North Korea, regardless of prior planning, that the U.S. and Korea might have different desired end states. So how much are the United States and South Korea maybe on the same page? And could the priorities of the two governments that they place on stability versus, say, denuclearization be a potential conflict in terms of goals?
Well, yes, I think that's always a problem, and I think that there have been different views. One thing I would say, though, is since 2009, both President Lee and President Obama, then President Park and President Obama, and then in June of 2017, June 30th, the joint statement between President Moon and President Trump have all stated that our objective is peaceful unification. And so unification has been part of the joint vision through successive presidents. Now, whether it's peaceful or not is really a function of decision-making in the North. But the fact that unification is our vision, and I think, I've always thought that that's really the only long-term solution is unification under a united Republic of Korea. But there are differences in how to handle things, and there always have been. And that is why we need anything that happens has to be built on the foundation of the strength of the alliance. And even though there are differences, those are things we can work out through the military committee or through the current MOFA and state strategy working group. These are the things that we need to reconcile, and recognize that the conditions are going to change and evolve and so objectives are going to change. But we really need to, and we need to work hard on aligning our interests and ensuring they're sufficiently aligned, recognizing that they will never be exactly aligned. And that's just the nature of alliances.
So Terrence Matsuo wants to know, Article 3 of the Mutual Defense Treaty says that an armed attack in the Pacific area on either party's territories, now under their respective administrative control, would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would meet the common danger, that they would meet the common danger. Would a cyber attack on either South Korea or the United States fall under this article?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the thinking on responses to cyber attacks and, is it an act of war? Those, I think we're still working our way through that. I think it's interesting to note, bringing up the Mutual Defense Treaty, is that there's no mention of DPRK or North Korea in that. And what you read from Article 3 is attacks in the region, in the Pacific area, on either force. But I think cyber is something that we have to work our way through, and I think we have to understand that cyber capabilities can be deadly. They may not achieve initial kinetic effects, but if you take down infrastructure of Seoul or New York City or Washington, D.C., you are going to create tremendous problems for the citizens in those countries if you're not able to restore the power grids. And so they're very dangerous, and we should consider whether that's an act of war or not.
So I have one last question for you because we're almost out of time. This comes from David Roden. What he would like to know is, what role would Japan play with respect to any intervention by the United States?
Well, I think he probably knows by asking that question how complex the relationship is between Japan and South Korea, and historical animosity. During the Korean War, Japan played a huge role. Most people might not remember that most Korean forces were actually trained in Japan as they were rebuilding the South Korean army. It provides tremendous logistical support, whether war or instability. The 7 United Nations designated bases in Japan are critical to whatever happens on the peninsula. I think Japan is going to be faced with missile threats, from rogue elements in the north. So integrated missile defense is critically important. And of course, naval operations. As I mentioned, securing naval routes from North Korea to prevent proliferation is going to be important, as well as it is likely that some refugees trying to escape the violence inside North Korea may try to escape by boat. And so Japan will likely have a role in securing refugees at sea who are in unpowered seacraft. It takes about 5 days for them to drift from the North Korean East Coast to the Japanese coastline. And so I think Japan will play a role in that as well. So I'll stop there.
Well, Dave, I'd like to thank you. I mean, this is a really huge topic. I mean, 30 minutes just doesn't necessarily do it justice. There's a lot of things that, we could have touched on and got into. I had more questions. There are more questions here in the queue. And I think, this is something that we need to think through, because, it's better to be, obviously no one wants there to be instability. We'd much rather have some type of negotiated solution to all of this. But, in life, sometimes you don't have a choice in terms of, how situations play out. So we need to think through these types of situations and how they work. And I really appreciate you coming on today to talk with us about this.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. And I'm reminded of what Dr. Kirk Campbell, when he was the DASD for East Asia Pacific, and we were briefing him in this in 1998. And after we laid out all this, the complexity and uncertainty, he said, there's only 2 ways to be prepared for instability and collapse in North Korea. And that's to be ill-prepared or to be really ill-prepared. And I certainly hope that we can be better than at least ill-prepared. Thank you very much, Troy.
No, glad to. And I would just say that, I know nothing ever goes the way you plan, because you can't really plan for every circumstance, but I'd hope we'd be better than ill-prepared, that we'd at least be prepared. So maybe I'll add a third option to that. But thanks again. Before I let everyone go, I'd just like to let you know, as I mentioned at the top, this is the part of a new series that we're going to be doing. And we have some upcoming events coming up that you might be interested in. Next Tuesday, May 12th, we'll have a conversation with General Walter Skip Sharp on the SMA talks. We have an event the next day with the OECD experts who have put together a new report on North Korea's economy. We're going to have a conversation with Andre Abrahaman, one of our non-resident fellows, on May 19th, and one that I'm really looking forward to. And we now have baseball in South Korea. The KBO started last night. And so Ambassador Mark Lippert and some other experts will be joining us. And by this, I mean like a former pro scout, current agent in South Korea will be joining us to have a discussion about the KBO, what it means for MLB, and sort of what we can look forward to this season. And with that, thank you, everyone.